tell me when you want to
Go.
go.
Go for it.
Are we going?
Sure.
This is a go. Oh, you're on?
We're on.
There's no red lights. I can't tell. Okay. Well, hi, Eric. I know you're here to get some of the story of how the Childs family found their way to Norfolk and Canaan, Connecticut, and got involved with this wonderful entity that we call Great Mountain Forest. Primarily, it begins, as you well know, with my grandfather, my namesake, Starling Winston Childs, and his best friend from Yale in his undergraduate years, who was Frederick C. Walcott. And the two of them had made their way to New York after Yale and some postgraduate degrees, and both of them were involved in the financial industry, financial services. So they both agreed that they ought to find a place up in the countryside where their families could learn to camp and fish and do the things that they liked to do. And my grandfather had looked into the Adirondacks, but it was Fred's interest. He had a family, an uncle, who had been a country doctor here in Norfolk. And he said, you know, you don't need to go all the way to the Adirondacks to find a place like that, because there's this place in Norfolk, Connecticut, and it's very much like the Adirondacks, but not nearly as far away from New York City. So what they did is they got on a train and they headed up here and found an old farm that bordered the lake, the Toby Pond. Over time, from 1909, when they first bought the 400 acres, it included a lot of the shoreline of Toby Pond from the Burr family. They're an old family of Norfolk, and the then farmer of this particular piece where we're sitting actually today wanted to move closer to town. He didn't like living up here on the mountain, as he called it. Too difficult to get back and forth in the wintertime in a horse-drawn sleigh. So my grandfather bought the farm, and Fred and he split up portions of it so that they could each have their own houses, their own family houses. And then they proceeded to then undertake something that was very bold and ambitious. And as my father used to say, it was really Senator Walcott. Fred Walcott went on to become a state senator, and it was really his goal to demonstrate what was at that early period in American history, sort of the progressive movement, was to demonstrate that private individuals needed to show how forest conservation and wildlife conservation, or what we call today ecological restoration, could go hand in hand. And so what Fred Walcott advocated was that they purchase enough of a piece of a property, large enough, that they could both reintroduce wild game back into the forest. And so I've started at the turn of the 20th century, but in fact it was the end of the 19th century where the iron industry here had pretty much run its course. There were still a couple blast furnaces operating in the early 1900s, but they had pretty much run out of trees to cut to make the fuel for their furnaces.
Charcoal.
And it hadn't run out of hadn't run out of the iron yet, but they had run out of the fuel, the charcoal that was made from the forest. And so you can imagine that these two gentlemen from New York, what they were looking at was a very young, almost scrub forest, literally sprouting back off its own roots, really not having much to speak of as far as timber or any value, tree size, all of it being young, what they call primary growth forest, or secondary growth in this case, could have been cut and cut again. But what it was perfect for were game birds and cover for deer and wildfowl, and they were also interested in waterfowl, which is why they liked having this pond as part of their purchase. And very quickly they were able to acquire several thousand acres from these iron companies. There were two iron companies, the Barnum Richardson and the Hunts Lyman iron companies were the two primary iron companies up here. And they were quickly looking to settle debts and get out of their situation because they couldn't operate sustainably. And so they were only too happy to sell properties, or properties that they had given to some of their accounts payable. They would give a piece of property or a deed to a piece of property on the mountain to someone they owed money to, and then that person would come to Childs and Walcott and say, would you guys be interested in this land up on the mountain? It's good for nothing, high rock land with just scrub forest, and I understand you're buying land. And so they would. They bought land at about 5 or 10 cents an acre, which in those days was even considered a ridiculously high price, since there were no trees on it and the land wasn't, you couldn't plow it, wasn't arable, had little or no foreseeable value for at least another 100 years until the trees grew back. And they said, that's okay, because we're going to raise these birds and these deer in captivity and then gradually release them into what they hoped would be a large enough parcel of property that the animals could just naturalize and sustain themselves. They tried wild turkey, but wild turkey need older forests, so they didn't do very well. And they controlled predators. They had a gamekeeper who went out after all the predators to be sure that they didn't predate on the birds that they were reintroducing. And so that was the era of what was known as the Childs Walcott Game Preserve, and that sort of ran from the early 1910, let's say, 1909, up to around 1930 something, after the Depression, I'd say. It was still Childs Walcott Game Preserve, or known as such. But my dad, Edward Childs, had graduated with a degree from the Yale School of Forestry in New Haven, and was particularly interested in the forest and what was being done here. They had planted a lot of young old abandoned fields in places, not so much charcoal land, but old farms that were in holds within the forest itself. The Chattleton farm and the Dean farm and some of the old farms on the Canaan side of the property, over in Falls Village side, lent themselves to these old fields that weren't very good agricultural fields, but they thought, well, it'd be interesting to plant trees there. So they began a planting program of red pine and Douglas fir and trees that might do well in this climate, and also providing additional cover for the game birds that they were releasing, because game birds need evergreens to run in and get away from birds of prey. So there are a number of, those are the older areas on the forest of introduced planted trees. We've since lost the red pine, that's an aside, but we can come to that period. But my dad was interested in the forest, so grandfather gave his half interest to the property to my dad and said, "Ted, you're a forester. You know what to do with the forest now. Why don't you oversee this?" And but that being the Depression and all those periods, Dad didn't live here at that time. He ended up taking a job elsewhere, and so he decided to call it, around that time, I believe, he decided to rename it, not the Childs Walcott Game Preserve, but he came up with the name Great Mountain Forest. And by that time it was roughly 4,000 or 5,000 acres in size. And so he liked, stripping the names of the two families off and calling it what he said, always maintained, was what the native people that came into this area of Connecticut referred to the Canaan Mountain Massif, which you see from Falls Village where you live. You look up at the escarpment of Canaan Mountain, which is a long plateau-like assemblage of hills rising very steeply out of the limestone valley of Under Mountain Road and over there on the Canaan side of the forest. So all of that was of interest to Dad, but as I started to say, the war years sort of intervened, if you will, and the company that he had been working for down in Pennsylvania was nationalized by the U.S. government, and he was called up, unbeknownst to him. He'd retired a commission as a second lieutenant with the Army Reserve back in the early 30s. And the next thing he knew, he was being drafted back into the Army as a private because he had some strategic information that the government kind of wanted, but they also wanted, every able-bodied man to serve the country. And so he showed up and went off to Aberdeen Proving Grounds down in Delaware and put in his time serving for a while and was almost ready to ship out, I think, to the Pacific Theater. I have his diary of that period when he was out in San Francisco getting ready to board ships to the Pacific Theater, when he was ordered back to Washington by the War Department. The Secretary of War Stimson specifically sent him a request to report immediately to Washington on a top secret assignment. And this is, as you alluded to earlier, his assignment was to come back to Washington, whereupon he ran into a gentleman who was a colonel, retired colonel with the Army, but had been he was a graduate of the Yale School of Forestry from the class of 1913, and had met Dad when my dad worked in the Philippines back in the 20s, teaching school, and they had formed a bond of friendship and from those times. Obviously an older gentleman and a mentor and mentee relationship, but he wanted Dad to head up this program of taking all of the cinchona plants that he had been developing in the Philippines prior to the fall to the Japanese, and he'd actually removed all of his research plots, all of his growing stock, all of the seeds, and destroyed everything else so the Japanese couldn't take over these plantations in the Philippines, and that had brought everything back east to Americas, and then needed to find a similar place to grow what became quinine, which was an anti-malarial drug. So you mentioned that as we started out, so I thought I'd add this. But Dad's degree in forestry and his commission as a commissioned sergeant at the time, he rose pretty quickly from buck private through to a sergeant. And they quickly elevated him, I think, to a lieutenant, to send him off to Costa Rica. So luckily for me, or I don't think I'd be here, because I think he would have been cannon fodder on the beaches of who knows which, Guadalcanal or someplace. But so he was sent to Costa Rica on a top secret mission to clear forests on the mountainsides and then see to the planting of these basically plantations of cinchona, from which the quinine, they derive a distillate from the bark of that tree, is the quinine they used at that time for antimalarials. But so that was Dad's years, mostly from the 40s right into about 1946, whereupon he came back here to Norfolk to spend a few final years with his father, who was still alive, and Fred Walcott. Senator Walcott was still here. And then after that, that was when he really began to get very earnest about seeing that the forest it was now a 40, 50, 60-year-old forest, give or take, where the trees were coming back, and they required a good deal of actual intervention on behalf. Foresters like to enter forests every 10 or 15 years and thin out the competing trees and choose those trees which are going to be the future crop trees. And so it was at a prime time where he could and basically apply his own knowledge of forest management, but also he felt strongly that young men who were studying forestry come here and learn and work for him. So he set up a summer program where he'd have 4 or 5 young forestry students, learning all the ins and outs of managing forests, everything from managing road network or building roads, which are very important. If you're managing forests, you need to be able to get into your forest to manage the trees. So he was establishing the road network at that time and opening the forest up so that it could be a more manageable area. And many people who know New England know that there was a massive hurricane in 1938, and it caused foresters throughout New England to tremble in their boots, because it was probably, as Category 5 hurricanes go, it was right up there at the top of the scale, that Beaufort scale. And the tidal surge dragged houses off their foundations, and thousands of people were drowned at sea.
When this tropical terror struck, swept over outer Long Island, swept into thickly settled, highly developed New England, struck with winds roaring 100, 150, almost 200 miles an hour.
So no one really had any early warning that this thing was coming, this massive, massive storm. But what it did is the winds on the east side of the storm are incredibly catastrophic, as you know, and 100-mile-an-hour winds or more. And they went up through eastern Connecticut, up curved sort of into central and eastern Massachusetts, and then made its way up through Vermont, and was still causing damage as far north as Montreal days later. But meanwhile here, all we had was a significant amount of rain, but very little of the wind that you get on the eastern quadrant of the storm. The backside of the storm is much less damaging wind. So we still had a standing forest here, whereas Yale had just taken possession of another private forest, 7,000-acre forest over in eastern Connecticut, in a town called Union, or Ashford and Union, 2 towns. And that 7,000-acre forest had a similar history to this, not so much the charcoaling, but more revegetated, reforested old abandoned farmland is what that mostly was. But it was an impressive forest, and this graduate of the School of Forestry thought that Yale should have it for a summer field camp. Well, needless to say, the forest was flattened, and in fact, Childs and Walcott knew the founder of the School of Forestry, Mr. Pinchot, who went on to found the U.S. Forest Service. He called Childs and Walcott and said, "You gentlemen have a forest up in northwestern Connecticut, and you had none of the damaging winds. Is there anywhere on your property where we could locate a camp where we could train students of forestry in the in the years to come, because it's going to be probably decades before our forest is going to be recognizable again or usable for that type of education. So yeah, that was what he did. And then Dad was the owner of the forest, half owner with Senator Walcott, and so the two of them had this camp built with actually materials off the forest. A lot of it was building materials that they harvested from local mills here, and built this camp, complete with 4 bunkhouses and a staff house and a big classroom and a wonderful. So it was modeled after an Adirondack camp, actually.
Before we run out of time, Star, what are some of your memories of your dad? Some of your early,
Oh my!
you know.
Oh, they're wonderful. Yeah, as my siblings would say the same. He was a father that had already sort of looked after his nieces and nephews, but living as a pretty much devoted bachelor. Or what do you say? Not devoted, but he had pretty much assumed he was a bachelor for the duration, having moved up here to take care of his ailing father, and then moving into this property here, and pretty much overseeing the welfare of these young men who would work for him in the summer and other things. Whereupon he lucked out and met the nanny for my cousins, who was living, actually they were living here in the house for one summer.
Elizabeth?
Elizabeth was actually a family member of the Walcott family. She came down out of Utica, New York, near New York Mills, and because her family knew Fred Walcott, and he said, "Well, I know a young woman who could take care of your cousins, my cousins' kids, or my nieces and my dad's nieces and nephews." And so he was living here with the nanny, and she took quite a liking to him. And lo and behold, a year later, after she finished that summer, they got married. And I don't think he ever thought he'd have his own kids, but Mom quickly produced my sister, Betsy, Elizabeth, and then I followed a year later, and then it was a couple more years before the Ned and Ann arrived, and so we had a family of 4 kids, who couldn't have been happier to have this father with an old Model A who liked to go bustling along through the woods road, and allowed us to ride on the running boards and bounce up and down in the seats on the car, because he would go fast over bumps that he almost felt like he designed roads to be like a roller coaster, because he liked roller coasters. So some of the woods roads feel like roller coasters in places, and especially if you're in a Model A tootling along at 20-25 miles an hour. And so we remember everything. I remember some of the earliest, most fond memories. We had raspberry patches down the hill here by the nursery, the tree nursery, because they were raising a lot of young tree seedlings. And we would go down there and make little forts in the long grass, the ryegrass, and some of the beds. We'd press it all down, and then we would pick raspberries and tell stories in this long grass, little forted area. He allowed me to come out and work with him in the woods. I remember as just a kid getting off the school bus, he would oftentimes be right along the main road here, coming up the hills. You came up Windrow Road, pruning pine branches off the young pine trees, and sort of making clear wood for the future, taking the lower branches off. And I would build debris forts. I was in 2nd or 3rd grade, but I would collect the branches and then lean a thing up against the tree and make like a tent-like fort with the branches as he dropped them down to me. And so it was great fun. He loved having us in the woods with him, taking us blueberry picking down to the lake, and he built a great little beach for us. So we had kids. I got a canoe for a birthday present when I was 10 years old. Who does that? And I liked fishing, and he liked to take us fishing.
And hunting?
Hunting didn't come around till about when I was 13 or 14, he took me for my first duck hunting trip. That was very exciting. I wasn't trusted to be swinging a firearm, a live loaded firearm, until I was that old enough, he felt. So, and we never did any deer hunting per se, but I was taught that by the forester and another forester subsequently. You know, how do you not only just how do you shoot a deer, but then what do you do? How do you gut it, skin it, and butcher it? It's easy to shoot them, then the work begins. You have to drag them out and gut them, and oh yeah. So, but Dad liked venison. He never was much of a hunter of game, of the larger game. He liked duck hunting, and but yeah, that was something that our grandfather was mad for. He loved duck hunting. So that was there's a long tradition of waterfowling and duck hunting, and that goes way back in the family history.
Star, you've been great.
Have I been all right?
Yeah. I really enjoyed this.
I wonder, I always say to the students that I talk to from Yale, I say, I'll never tell you the same story twice. But because I'll find a thread and off I go, you know. Someone has to sort of come back in here and you started down that road and then you didn't finish, you know, or something.
I think we did well.
Did we do all right?
Yeah.